He didn't make it. What a pity. But this fortune belongs to me and my daughter now. You will always be just a useless spare part." Rebecca's fake smile hissed through the screen, drowning in the clinking of champagne glasses on a luxury yacht. Just returning from a naval deployment, I rushed to the hospital, only to find my father, clinging to his last breaths utterly alone amidst a tangled mess of IV tubes in the ICU. Meanwhile, my stepmother was draining the very last pennies of his hard-earned money to fund her relentless partying. Rage violently constricted my chest. I coldly hung up the video call with my stepmother and immediately contacted my liaison at the FBI Financial Crimes Division. With exactly one command, every single one of her credit cards was instantly frozen white. Exactly 60 minutes later, my phone rang with Rebecca's hysterical screams. She was in a blind panic, but she had no idea. The exact second my father's heart monitor flatlined for the third time, I pressed start on a 72-hour countdown to officially make her pay the ultimate price. Before continuing, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really want to know the ending of this story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I pushed through the swinging doors of the ICU, and the thick, sickening stench of rubbing alcohol and bleach slammed into my lungs like a closed fist. That smell dragged my mind back 15 years to the afternoon. I packed my duffel bag and walked out of the Mendoza estate for the last time. I was 20 years old. I left behind the scent of my mother's perfume, the only warmth that house ever held, knowing full well that Rebecca's cheap aerosol would erase every trace of her within a week. I was right. My mother died of pancreatic cancer when I was 12. 3 months later, Rebecca appeared. She showed up at a charity gala. My father, hosted in my mother's memory, wearing a dress cut 2 inches too low for a funeral fundraiser, laughing too loudly at my father's grief-stricken attempts at small talk. Within 6 weeks, she was sleeping in my mother's bed. Within 3 months, her 10-year-old daughter Emily had moved into the room across the hall from mine, and the locks on my mother's jewelry cabinet had been changed. I found out when I tried to retrieve my mother's pearl hairpin for a school photo. Rebecca told me the cabinet was off limits. She said it with a smile that did not reach her eyes, her hand resting on my shoulder with just enough pressure to remind me that she was taller, older, and now occupying the center of my father's attention. I was 12. I did not understand the word gaslighting yet. I just knew that the house no longer smelled like my mother, and that the woman who replaced her watched me the way a cat watches a bird it has not yet decided to kill. The ICU room was freezing. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, casting a sickly greenish light across the tiles. My father, the man with the widest shoulders in the world, the architect who designed 3 of downtown's tallest skyscrapers, was reduced to a translucent shell beneath a thin hospital blanket. His cheekbones jutted through paper-thin skin. His wrists, once thick enough to snap a drafting pencil in half, were bruised purple from repeated IV insertions. I counted the bruises, 7 on his left arm alone. Nobody had rotated the insertion sites. Nobody had cared enough to try. I dropped my naval cap onto the metal chair beside the bed, the clang echoing off the sterile walls, and I stepped forward into the nightmare I had been running from for 15 years. I dropped to my knees beside the bed. My hands, thickly calloused from hauling ropes and scrubbing corrosive sea salt off flight deck panels, reached out to cradle his freezing bony fingers. The guilt hit me like a physical bayonet twisting between my ribs. For 8 years under Rebecca's roof, I had endured a daily psychological campaign designed to erase me from my own family. She rearranged the dinner seating, so I was always at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen, as if I were the hired help. She enrolled Emily in the same ballet class and told the instructor I had dropped out when I had never been asked. She held my father's attention, hostage manufacturing emergencies, whenever he and I had plans. A migraine on the day of my soccer championship, a burst pipe on the morning of my science fair. By the time I was 18, I had stopped expecting my father to show up. By 20, I had stopped expecting anything from anyone who shared my blood. I chose the Navy because the ocean could not gaslight me. The ocean did not rearrange the furniture while I slept. The ocean did not whisper that I was unlovable. A warship runs on disciplined hierarchy and earned respect. 3 things Rebecca's household had systematically denied me. But in choosing the ocean, I had abandoned my father to a den of vipers. I had traded my guilt for survival, and the interest on that debt had been compounding for 15 years. His bank statements, which I had subpoenaed during the flight from Norfolk, showed a systematic financial hemorrhage. Over $2 million drained in 18 months. Private jet charters, a yacht lease in Rebecca's name, a condo in Miami registered to Marcus Thorne's shell company. They had picked his bones clean while he lay in this bed, screaming for painkillers that never came. His eyelids fluttered heavy with exhaustion and the fog of whatever sedatives they had pumped into him. His gaze wandered unfocused across the ceiling tiles, before it finally locked onto my face. A faint, desperate spark ignited behind his pupils, his cracked lips parted. "Daughter, you look beautiful in your uniform, I'm sorry." His voice was barely a wisp of air. But those 4 words carried the crushing weight of a man who understood his catastrophic mistake. He had chosen loneliness over vigilance. He had let Rebecca into our home because he could not stand the silence after my mother died. And that single act of weakness had cost him everything. I squeezed his fingers, feeling the bones shift beneath the skin. I wanted to tell him I forgave him. I wanted to tell him I should have stayed. But the words jammed behind my teeth like a round that refused to chamber. The EKG machine flatlined. A long, piercing, continuous tone ripped through my eardrums, shredding the silence into jagged pieces. Nurses burst through the door. A crash cart slammed against the foot of the bed. I was shoved backward, my spine hitting the cold glass partition that separated the ICU bay from the hallway. Through that transparent wall, I saw a shadow. Marcus Thorne. He stood in the corridor, his tailored Italian suit perfectly pressed, his posture relaxed, his hands clasped behind his back, like a man waiting for a table at a fine restaurant. He did not flinch at the alarm. He did not lower his eyes. He simply stared at me, a condescending smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth. I had read his file during my deployment. 40 years old, wealth manager, former Goldman Sachs associate, who had been quietly let go for ethical irregularities that the firm buried under a settlement. He believed a military salary made me a government-funded peasant. He believed his offshore accounts made him untouchable. I watched his thumbs fly across his phone screen, firing off a text to Rebecca confirming the timeline, confirming that the old man was almost finished. My eyes memorized every contour of his smug, entitled face, the angle of his jaw, the slight scar above his left eyebrow, the way his right hand trembled almost imperceptibly when he realized I was staring back without blinking. The lead doctor stepped away from the bed. He pulled his gloves off slowly and shook his head. The nurses stopped moving. The machines were silenced. I walked back to the bed, my boots the only sound in the room. I reached down and gently brushed my fingertips across my father's eyelids, closing them for the final time. The skin was still warm. I swallowed the burning lump in my throat, forcing every tear back down into my chest, where it rapidly hardened into something cold and permanent. I picked up my naval cap from the chair, squared my shoulders until my spine was a steel rod, and executed a flawless, silent salute to the greatest architect I had ever known. I held the salute for 3 seconds. Then I lowered my hand, turned my back on the hospital bed, and marched down the hallway. My boot heels cracked against the linoleum in a steady, measured cadence. I did not look at Marcus as I passed him. I did not need to. He was already on the list. I would not mourn. I would execute a scorched earth campaign until every single parasite feeding off the Mendoza name was utterly eradicated. Dawn broke in a bruised purple smear across the sky as I pulled my rental sedan up to the Mendoza estate. I did not bother searching for the old keys. I lifted my right boot and delivered a violent tactical front kick directly into the rusted deadbolt. The lock shattered. The door frame splintered inward, sending a shower of rotten wood fragments across the marble foyer. Nort, the grand entrance, once smelling of fresh lilies and lemon polish when my mother was alive, was a war zone. Discarded designer shoeboxes littered the floor. Empty wine bottles, some still leaking dregs of burgundy liquid onto the white marble, were scattered like shell casings. A Gucci shopping bag hung from my mother's antique coat rack. I kicked it aside and marched straight into my father's private study. The antique mahogany desk was buried under towering stacks of luxury shopping receipts, layered beneath precisely drafted asset transfer contracts. A half-empty bottle of Chateau Margaux, $300 a pour, sat on top of my father's original architectural plans for the downtown library, leaving a dark wine ring on the blueprint. I pulled the first stack of documents toward me and flipped through the pages. Rebecca's signature dominated every bottom line, written in the same aggressive looping cursive she had used to sign Emily's private school enrollment 15 years ago. Back when my father was too deep in grief to read the tuition invoices she slipped between his morning mail. The dates on the transfer contracts aligned precisely with the weeks my father was bedridden and screaming in agony. She had shoved a pen into his trembling, sedated hand while he was too delirious with unmedicated pain to read the documents she held in front of his face. 3 properties transferred into shell companies linked to Marcus Thorne. 2 investment accounts liquidated the funds wired to an offshore holding in the Cayman Islands. A life insurance policy with the primary beneficiary changed from my name to Emily's dated 6 weeks before his final hospitalization. The signature on the change form shaky and irregular, the handwriting of a man who could barely hold a pen. Beneath that stack, I found a receipt for a private ambulance service that had transported my father from the mansion to a secondary care facility, not the hospital, for a 72-hour period that appeared nowhere in his official medical records. 72 hours unaccounted for. I photographed every single page with my phone, the flash illuminating the dark study in sharp clinical bursts, casting hard shadows across the walls of a room that had once smelled like my mother's fresh lilies, and now reeked of wine-stained greed. I pulled out my phone and dialed Rebecca's number on video call. The screen exploded with the pounding bass of yacht party music. Emily's face filled the frame first. She was draped in a white designer bikini, her spray-tanned skin glistening under tropical sun, a flute of vintage champagne dangling from her manicured fingers. She squinted at the camera, recognizing my face, and her lips curled into a vicious sneer. "Oh, look, the Navy sister is finally back, Mom. A little late, aren't we?" She emphasized the word late with a theatrical pout, tilting her champagne glass in a mock toast. Behind her, 2 college-aged men in swim trunks laughed at something off-screen. Emily's entire existence was a performance funded by stolen money. Every designer label she draped across her body was a desperate attempt to compensate for the fact that she had never earned a single dollar through her own effort. She had built her Instagram following on the illusion of inherited wealth, and looking at my chest full of military decorations only reminded her that she was a hollow, dependent fraud living inside her mother's con. Rebecca violently snatched the phone from Emily's hand. She leaned into the camera, her surgically tightened face stretching into a wide, disturbing grin that did not reach her eyes. The Botox had frozen her forehead into a permanent mask, but her jaw muscles flexed with barely contained hostility. "He's gone. What a pity. But you should remember, this fortune is now mine and my daughter's. You are just an outcast." Her voice carried the same poisonous sweetness she had used the night she told 12-year-old me that my bedroom was being converted into Emily's walk-in closet, that my mother's jewelry had been donated to a charity auction, that if I wanted dinner, I could eat after the family was finished. She had spent 15 years perfecting the art of making me feel like a guest in my own home, and now she was declaring total victory over a dead man's estate. I stood perfectly still, my facial muscles locked into a mask of absolute zero, my fingers curled inward, my trimmed nails digging so fiercely into my palms that warm blood pooled in the creases of my lifelines. I let Rebecca savor her hollow triumph for 3 agonizing seconds. I let Emily giggle in the background, taking another sip of champagne, completely insulated by her mother's manufactured reality. Then I spoke, my voice dropping into a lethal low-frequency register that I had perfected during years of issuing commands on a ship's bridge during heavy storms. "Just keep enjoying it," I growled. "Because that is the absolute last meal you will ever swallow using." I tapped the red button, cutting the feed. The study plunged back into suffocating silence. The blood on my palms had already begun to dry. By 2:30 in the afternoon, I was standing in the heavily secured office of Admiral Richard Hayes at the Norfolk Naval Intelligence Annex. The air smelled of strong black coffee, starched cotton, and the faint, metallic tang of encrypted communication equipment humming behind the walls. Richard sat behind his oak desk, his face carved from the same granite that lined the Pentagon's corridors. We had served together on the USS Eisenhower during a classified operation in the Strait of Hormuz 8 years ago. A fuel line had ruptured during a storm, and I had crawled into a flooded compartment to manually seal the valve while the rest of the damage control team evacuated. Richard had pulled me out when my oxygen ran low. He never mentioned it again. Neither did I. He owed me nothing. I owed him nothing. That was exactly why I trusted him with my father's last act of defiance. I slammed a stack of photographed evidence onto his desk: fraudulent wire transfers, forged signatures, and shell company routing numbers. They murdered him, and they're moving the money, I stated. Richard studied the documents for 4 seconds. He gave one sharp nod, picked up his secure red phone, and called his liaison at the FBI Financial Crimes Task Force. The evidence was overwhelming enough to bypass standard bureaucratic delays. The FBI secured an emergency federal injunction, striking the international banking networks with the speed and precision of a synchronized drone strike. Every account linked to Rebecca Mendoza, Emily Mendoza, and Marcus Thorne was locked within 45 minutes. Richard set the phone down, looked at me across the desk, and said 2 words: "Go hunting." At 4:00 in the afternoon, I marched through the towering glass doors of First National Bank's downtown headquarters. My combat boots cracked against the polished marble floors, each step echoing through the cavernous lobby like a gunshot. The security guard at the reception desk straightened in his chair. 2 bank tellers stopped mid-conversation. I did not slow down. I headed directly for the executive elevators. Marcus Thorne stepped out from behind a marble pillar, blocking my path. He adjusted his silk tie with one hand, a gesture designed to remind me of the price difference between his wardrobe and my uniform. He leaned snorts forward, planting himself in my trajectory. "Captain, the military taught you how to hold a gun, not how to run cash flows. Rebecca is already a step ahead of you." He delivered the insult with a rehearsed chuckle, his eyes darting sideways to the security guards to make sure he had witnesses. He genuinely believed his offshore accounts and corporate shell structures made him a god walking among peasants. I did not break stride. I stepped directly into his personal space, close enough to smell the sandalwood cologne, masking the sour scent of nervous perspiration underneath. He was forced to crane his neck upward to maintain eye contact. I stared through his pupils, past the arrogance, past the expensive haircut, directly into the trembling coward, hiding behind 30 years of other people's money. I lowered my voice to a whisper that only he could hear. "I don't know much about money, but I am an expert at hunting criminals. Let's see how your money saves you in front of a military intelligence tribunal." The blood drained from his cheeks in real time, his jaw clamped shut, so hard I heard his molars click. His hands, which had been adjusting his tie with practiced confidence, dropped to his sides and went rigid. The memory anchor buried deepest in Marcus Thorne's psychology was not greed, it was cowardice. He had spent his entire career hiding behind spreadsheets and encrypted wire transfers because he was physically terrified of men who carried actual authority and actual weapons. Civilian accountants could be bribed, federal agents with military backing could not. I held his gaze for 2 more seconds, watching the threat travel from his ears to his brainstem, watching the arrogance drain from his posture, the way color drains from a dying man's lips. Then, I deliberately stepped forward, my left shoulder slamming into his chest as I passed him. The impact was precise, delivered with the controlled force of someone trained in close-quarters combat, hard enough to stagger him, but light enough to look accidental on any security camera footage. He stumbled backward, his polished loafers squeaking on the polished marble. His hand shot out to grab the marble pillar for balance, his manicured fingers scraping against the stone. The 2 bank tellers behind the counter watched in frozen silence, their hands hovering over their keyboards. The security guard studied his desk, as if the laminated emergency procedures had suddenly become fascinating literature. Marcus Thorne stood alone in the middle of the lobby, his silk tie hanging crooked, his composure shattered, his phone already vibrating, in his breast pocket, with the first of what would be dozens of panicked notifications from his offshore banking contacts, confirming that every account bearing his name had been flagged for federal review. I stepped into the elevator without looking back. The brass doors chimed shut, sealing him on the other side. The opening barrage had landed directly on target, and the target was beginning to bleed. Midnight cloaked the Mendoza mansion in heavy shadow. I sat alone in my father's study, sorting through the last of the financial documents, when my phone vibrated against the mahogany desk. A text from Emily. The screen snorts glowed with a string of mocking emojis, followed by 7 words laced with digital venom. Go see what your stupid old man hid in the wine cellar. She was trying to humiliate me. She assumed I would find nothing but dust and old regrets, that I would kneel in the dark basement and cry over the ruins of my childhood while she partied on a yacht paid for with my father's blood. Her pathological need to assert dominance over the biological daughter was a compulsion she could never control. She wanted me broken. She had completely miscalculated my operational discipline. I descended the creaking wooden stairs into the cellar. The 3rd step groaned under my weight, the same groan it had made when I was 9, and sneaking down here to steal a grape from my father's wine collection. The air was thick with a damp, earthy smell of old wine corks, cold stone, and something else, a faint chemical trace that did not belong. Bleach. Someone had cleaned something down here recently. My tactical flashlight cut a tight white beam through the darkness. Rows of dusty wine bottles lined the racks, but several slots were empty, their wooden cradles freshly wiped. Someone had been removing bottles and replacing them. I began a systematic grid-by-grid sweep of the brick walls, running my fingers along the cold mortar joints, searching for any irregularity in the texture. On the east wall, nothing. On the south wall, nothing but spiderwebs and condensation. My fingertips caught a slight, unnatural elevation behind the 3rd wine rack from the left, a section where the mortar was newer than its neighbors, smoother, applied by someone who understood masonry at a professional level, an architect. A memory slammed into my chest with enough force to buckle my knees. I was 9 years old, sitting cross-legged on this very floor, the concrete cold through my pajama bottoms, watching my father teach me how to play chess on a folding board, balanced on a wine barrel. My mother was upstairs humming while washing the dinner dishes, the sound drifting down through the floorboards like a lullaby. My father moved his king into a seemingly exposed position on the board. I reached for his bishop, thinking I had caught him in a mistake. He gently caught my wrist. Protect the queen. He had whispered, his eyes twinkling in the single overhead bulb light. Even if it means the king must fall, the sacrifice is the strategy. I did not understand the lesson then. Standing in the same cellar 26 years later, my father dead and buried, I understood it with absolute devastating clarity. He was the king, I was the queen, and he had sacrificed himself to protect the board. I pressed the loose brick. A section of the wall shifted inward with a low grinding scrape, revealing a concealed digital safe. The size of a shoebox bolted directly into the concrete foundation. The keypad glowed a faint green. I punched in my deployment date, the only number he could be certain Rebecca would never guess. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside, resting on the cold metal shelf, was a single encrypted USB drive and a folded slip of paper with my father's handwriting. 2 words. Finish it. I plugged the drive into my secured laptop on the kitchen counter upstairs. The screen flickered, casting a harsh blue glow across my face in the darkened room. My father appeared on the screen. His face was deeply hollowed, his cheekbones sharp enough to cut paper, and his skin glistened with cold sweat. But his eyes burned with a terrifying clarity that I had not seen since before Rebecca entered our lives. He leaned toward the camera, his voice raw and gravelly, forcing each word through a throat that sounded like it had been scraped with sandpaper. Madison, I'm not stupid, my daughter. I know Rebecca and that bastard Dr. Alan Vance colluded with each other. They swapped my painkillers for placebos. My lungs seized. Dr. Alan Vance, the private physician, who had been managing my father's pain treatment for the last 2 years, the same man I had seen, lurking in the hospital hallway, sweating through his dress shirt, avoiding eye contact with everyone who passed. My father coughed violently, spattering the camera lens with flecks of blood, and continued, "I have secretly transferred the core assets into a charity trust. I need you to tear off their masks." He paused, staring directly into the lens, directly into my eyes across time and death. He had endured months of unmedicated agony, lying in that bed while they believed they had won, allowing them to grow complacent and floppy. Also, he could forge this weapon and place it in the one pair of hands he trusted. I reached out my trembling fingertips, tracing the cold pixels of his face on the screen. The single tear that escaped down my cheek evaporated almost instantly in the frigid cellar air. I memorized every word, every cough, every fleck of blood on the lens. Then I closed the laptop with a sharp, definitive snap. The blue light died. The kitchen plunged into total darkness. I stood up slowly, feeling the vertebrae in my spine stack and lock into a rigid column. The grieving daughter who had knelt beside a hospital bed 12 hours ago was gone. Standing in her place was an apex predator, holding the exact coordinates to obliterate an entire criminal enterprise. The suffocating oak-paneled air of the county courthouse pressed down on my shoulders like a physical weight, perfectly mirroring the phantom pressure of my father's dying gasps. I sat in the second row behind the plaintiff's table, my navy dress uniform pressed to razor-sharp creases, every medal and ribbon positioned according to regulation. Across the aisle, Rebecca was delivering a masterclass in theatrical grief. She dabbed her bone-dry eyes with a silk handkerchief monogrammed with the Mendoza family crest, a crest she had no blood right to wear. Her lawyer, a slick downtown litigator with a $2,000 haircut, painted me as a greedy, estranged militant daughter who had abandoned her dying father and was now swooping in to steal a grieving widow's lifeline. Rebecca's manufactured sobs echoed off the courtroom walls, each one calibrated to hit the frequency of a wounded animal. Next to her, Emily aggressively chewed a piece of gum, her jaw working in furious circles, glaring at me across the aisle with unfiltered hatred. She wore a black designer dress that cost more than a junior enlisted sailor's monthly paycheck. The price tag was still tucked inside the collar. She had not even bothered to remove it. The gallery behind me was packed. Local reporters filled the press bench, their cameras prohibited, but their notebooks open and pens moving. 2 rows behind Rebecca, a woman I did not recognize, sat perfectly still watching the proceedings with the detached interest of a professional evaluator. I made a mental note. Edward Martinez, my litigation attorney and a former JAG officer who had prosecuted war crimes in 3 different theaters, slowly rose to his feet. He was 6'3", built like a former college linebacker who had traded the field for law school, and when he stood, the entire courtroom felt smaller. Edward had told me his strategy the night before over cold coffee in his office. "We don't argue with tears," he had said, aligning his documents into a precise stack. "We make the tears irrelevant." He did not raise his voice. He did not acknowledge Rebecca's performance. He simply tapped a single key on his laptop, and the massive courtroom monitors flickered to life. The first image was a side-by-side comparison of the offshore wire transfers, routing numbers highlighted in bright red, showing the precise path of $2. $3 million from my father's personal accounts, through Marcus Thorne's shell company in the Cayman Islands, and into Rebecca's private account in Switzerland. The second image was a freeze frame from my father's video confession. Edward pressed play. My father's booming digitized voice filled the courtroom, echoing off the oak panels, bouncing off the marble floors, slamming into every ear in the gallery. Rebecca's manufactured sobbing choked in her throat. The sound died like a motor running out of fuel. Her mask shattered in real time. Her eyes bulged, the whites fully visible around her irises as the undeniable proof of her conspiracy echoed through the silent room. Her lawyer grabbed her wrist under the table, squeezing hard enough to leave marks, at desperate signal to stay quiet. My gaze swept slowly away from Rebecca's trembling face, cutting across the courtroom gallery, until it locked onto the back row, Dr. Alan Vance was shrinking into the wooden bench, trying to make his 6 feet frame invisible. Sweat poured down his forehead in heavy, glistening sheets. His hands shook violently in his lap, fingers interlaced, knuckles white. He heard his own name blast through the courtroom speakers as my father's recorded voice accused him of swapping painkillers for placebos. His past medical malpractice scandal, the one Rebecca had used to blackmail him into compliance, was seconds away from becoming public record. His eyes darted upwards, searching for escape, and collided directly with my stare. I looked at him with the mechanical detachment of an executioner examining a completed task. No anger, no satisfaction, just snorts the cold, clinical acknowledgement that he was already dead, and simply had not stopped breathing yet. He physically recoiled against the bench, the color draining from his face like water through a cracked vessel. The judge slammed his gavel down with a deafening crack that split the courtroom silence like a rifle shot. He issued a permanent injunction, stripping Rebecca of all executor rights effective immediately. Rebecca shrieked a feral, undignified sound that ripped through her carefully constructed elite persona. She grabbed her lawyer by the lapels of his suit jacket, shaking him, demanding he do something. Fix it, appeal it, make it go away. The gallery erupted in whispers. Emily's jaw finally stopped chewing. I stood up smoothly from my seat, adjusted my cuffs with absolute precision, and buttoned my uniform jacket. I had just severed their main financial artery. The blood was in the water. I turned and walked through the double doors without looking back, leaving them to begin tearing each other apart in the wreckage. If you have ever had to defend your personal boundaries against toxic relatives in your own life, please take a second to give this video a like. Share your own survival story in the comments below, because reading your experiences gives me strength, and I want you to know you are never fighting alone. I returned to the estate the following afternoon and found the front doors hanging from their hinges, blown wide open, like the jaw of a gutted animal. The destruction was total. Furious over her courtroom humiliation and the complete loss of her executor rights, Rebecca Snorts had unleashed Emily and a crew of 4 hired thugs to systematically ransack every room in the property. China cabinets were overturned, their contents shattered across the marble in piles of white and blue porcelain dust. My father's framed architectural blueprints, 40 years of designs that he had hung along the hallway with custom brackets he welded himself, had been torn from the walls and stomped flat. His drafting table in the study was flipped on its side, the precision arms snapped in half. Family photographs had been pulled from the shelves, and the glass smashed, the photos left face down in the debris. I stepped through the foyer, my boots crunching over shattered porcelain, and stopped dead. Emily was standing in the center of the living room, surrounded by debris, holding my biological mother's vintage pearl hairpin. The only heirloom I had left. The only physical object connecting me to the woman who had braided my hair every morning before school, who had hummed hymns while cooking dinner, who had died with my name on her lips. Emily's eyes burned with a frantic, jealous rage that went far deeper than the courtroom loss. She could not stand the fact that I possessed a real legacy, a real bloodline, while she was nothing more than a squatter sleeping in stolen sheets. She lifted the hairpin to eye level, making sure I could see every pearl, and her lips peeled back into a snarl. That pathetic woman's trash belongs in the garbage, she shrieked and hurled the hairpin onto the marble floor. She lifted her designer stiletto heel and ground it directly into the delicate pearls. I heard them crack, a sound like tiny bones snapping. The low rumble of a V8 engine vibrated through the shattered windows. Marcus's black luxury sedan rolled onto the front lawn, crushing the landscaping under its wide tires. He killed the engine but did not exit the vehicle. Instead, he rolled down his tinted window, produced a thick imported cigar from his breast pocket, and took his time lighting it. He blew a dense cloud of acrid gray smoke in my direction, the fumes drifting through the broken doorway and mixing with the dust of the destroyed foyer. He leaned his head back against the leather headrest, flashing a wide, arrogant grin. He was making a statement. His dirty money had orchestrated this destruction, and he was confident enough to sit in the front row and watch. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to drop to my knees and gather the broken pearls with shaking hands, confirming everything he believed about women in uniform. He wanted me to break. The fire in my chest solidified into something permanent. I did not raise my voice. I did not bend down to touch the shattered pearls. I calmly reached into my uniform pocket, retrieved my smartphone, and pressed the record button. I panned the camera in a slow, steady arc across the devastated room, capturing the overturned furniture, the destroyed blueprints, the boot prints and porcelain dust. I zoomed in on Emily's face, catching the exact moment her rage flickered into fear as she realized what I was doing. I angled the camera through the broken window, locking the frame onto Marcus's license plate, his face and the cigar between his fingers. Then I dialed the local precinct, my voice as level and detached as a flight controller issuing runway coordinates. Yes, I have an active home invasion and destruction of evidence in progress at 4417 Ridgecrest Drive. Multiple suspects on scene. Marcus's grin vanished. The cigar froze halfway to his lips. The ember at the tip trembled. I lowered the phone and took 3 deliberate steps toward the shattered doorway, close enough for Marcus to hear every syllable through his open window. Rats always bite the hardest right before they're thrown into the cage, I stated, my voice ringing with crystal-clear lethality across the ruined lawn. Marcus stiffened in his leather seat, his fingers trembling so violently that a chunk of burning ash dropped from his cigar onto the cream-colored leather, searing a black mark into the upholstery. Emily stood frozen in the center of the living room, surrounded by the evidence of her own tantrum, her designer heels still resting on the crushed pearls. The realization hit her face in slow motion. Her vandalism had just handed me a documented felony, trespassing, and destruction of evidence charge on a silver platter. I stepped over the broken glass and walked to my car. They had tried to break my psyche by destroying the last piece of my mother. Instead, they had wrapped the noose around their own necks and handed me the other end of the rope. The air inside Detective James Morales' office smelled of stale coffee, warm printer ink, and the faint chemical tang of redacted documents. Morales sat behind his battered metal desk, a 20-year veteran of the County Major Crimes Unit, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of old leather. He tossed a thick dossier onto the desk between us, the manila cover stamped with a red classified seal. "I'm going to be straight with you, Captain," he said, rubbing his jaw. "This isn't a simple gold digger case." He flipped the dossier open. The first page was a federal intelligence brief linking Rebecca to a multi-state criminal syndicate known internally as the Black Widow Network, a ring of professional female con artists who specifically targeted terminally ill wealthy men. Rebecca was not a random opportunist who had stumbled into my father's life. She was a senior operative. Marcus Thorne was her dedicated money launderer, responsible for moving the stolen assets through a series of offshore shell companies before the victims' families could even file probate. And Dr. Alan Vance was the network's corrupted physician, the man responsible for falsifying death certificates, manipulating medications, and ensuring the targets deteriorated quickly enough to prevent intervention. My father was not their first victim. Morales slid 3 additional case files across the desk, spreading them out like a dealer laying cards. 3 other wealthy men in the tri-state area, all dead within the last 5 years, all treated by Dr. Vance, all with new wives who had appeared within months of their terminal diagnoses. The first was a retired shipping magnate in Connecticut, age 71, whose second wife had vanished with $4 million 3 weeks after his death. The second was a widowed hedge fund manager in New Jersey, age 68, whose private physician, Dr. Alan Vance, had prescribed an experimental pain regimen that accelerated his organ failure. The third was a real estate developer in upstate New York, whose daughter had filed a wrongful death lawsuit that was quietly settled out of court when the key witness, a home nurse, disappeared from the state. The pattern was surgical. Identify the target, isolate him from his biological family, install the physician, drain the assets, accelerate the death, disappear the evidence. My father had been their most ambitious target and their most dangerous mistake because my father had fought back from the inside. A civil lawsuit isn't going to cut it. Captain Morales muttered, leaning back in his creaking chair, the springs groaning under his weight. These professionals will scatter like roaches the second they smell a federal case. We need a confession from the inside, and we need it before Marcus's lawyers find a way to unfreeze his passport. I stared at the mugshots pinned to the corkboard behind his desk. Rebecca's booking photo from a 10-year-old fraud charge in Ohio that had been mysteriously dismissed after the arresting officer retired early on an undisclosed settlement. Her hair was shorter in the photo, darker, and her name was listed as Rebecca Stanton, not Mendoza. She had changed identities at least once before entering my father's life. Marcus's corporate headshot gleamed with manufactured confidence, his teeth too white, his collar too stiff, his eyes holding the blank, predatory focus of a man who viewed other human beings as either assets or liabilities. Vance's medical board portrait showed a man already drowning his smile tight and forced his eyes darting slightly left of the camera lens, as if checking whether someone was watching from behind the V. I knew exactly how to crack every single one of them. I drove back to my temporary quarters, a 2-bedroom rental near the base, and cleared the dining room's table. I moved the chairs against the wall, laid a sheet of butcher paper across the surface, and began constructing a psychological war room. Printed surveillance photographs went on the left, financial flowcharts drawn on legal pads covered the center. A timeline of every interaction, every transaction, every hospital visit, every phone call log ran along the right edge color-coded with highlighters. Red for Rebecca, blue for Marcus, green for Vance. The overlapping zones where their activities intersected were colored black. There were a lot of black zones. I did not need weapons for this phase. I needed envelopes. I carefully drafted 2 anonymous letters, each one precision-engineered to exploit the specific psychological fracture point I had identified in each target. Dr. Vance's entire identity was built on the desperate need to avoid prison. He had buried a malpractice lawsuit 12 years ago that would have ended his career, and Rebecca had discovered the buried settlement and used it as a leash. Marcus worshipped money the way a priest worshipped scripture. His offshore accounts were not just wealth, they were his identity, his armor, his proof of superiority. Strip the money away, and Marcus Thorne was nothing but a terrified accountant in a suit he could no longer afford. I was going to detonate their loyalties from the inside, turning the Mendoza mansion into a psychological killing floor, where their own paranoia would do the work for me. I slipped the bait into the mailstream the following morning. For Dr. Vance, a plain white envelope with no return address, containing a photocopy of the bribery receipts I had recovered from my father's safe, and a single typed sentence centered on a blank page. Rebecca is about to turn you into the scapegoat. For Marcus, a priority courier package containing high-resolution surveillance photographs of his hidden Cayman Island accounts, each one stamped with a red FBI evidence marker, accompanied by a typed note. Money cannot save you anymore. I licked the seals, tasting the bitter adhesive on my tongue. Smanad. Each envelope was a carefully measured injection of paranoia, designed to rupture the fragile trust holding their syndicate together. Trust built on greed collapses the moment the money is threatened. Trust built on blackmail collapses even faster. I parked my rental sedan across the street from Vance's private clinic that afternoon. Engine off, windows cracked an inch for airflow. I sipped cold coffee from a thermos and waited. The courier truck pulled up to the clinic's front entrance at exactly 3:15. The driver disappeared inside for less than a minute. I watched through my binoculars. Less than 5 minutes after the delivery, Vance burst out of the clinic's side door. His white coat was half off his shoulders, flapping behind him like a broken wing. His face was the color of wet concrete. He fumbled with his cell phone, dialing with fingers that shook so badly he had to try 3 times before the call connected. He paced the sidewalk in tight, frantic circles, gesturing wildly at the air, screaming into the phone. He was terrified of taking the fall. Across town, my contacts at the federal marshal's office confirmed that Marcus had immediately attempted to book a one-way flight to Geneva through a private charter service, only to discover that his passport had been flagged for a federal travel restriction. He was trapped. The pressure was crushing them from every direction. I had constructed the final stage. All that remained was to herd the wounded animals into one room and watch them turn on each other. Heavy black clouds swallowed the late afternoon sky. Thunder rolled in the distance, and the first fat drops of rain began to slap against the windshield. Rebecca had crawled back to the Mendoza mansion, sending me a text offering a negotiation meeting to discuss a fair settlement. She thought she was buying time to plan an escape. She had no idea I had already summoned Vance and Marcus to the exact same location through separate anonymous messages, each one implying that the other was about to betray them to the authorities. I pulled up to the estate. The front door had been temporarily repaired with a sheet of plywood and a padlock that I snapped open with the key Morales had provided. I stepped through the makeshift entrance into the dimly lit living room. The electricity had been partially restored, but half the overhead fixtures were shattered from Emily's vandalism, casting the room in a patchwork of harsh light and deep shadow. The three of them were already there, scattered across the room like hostile animals, forced into the same cage, each one keeping maximum distance from the others. Rebecca stood shut by the cold, ash-filled fireplace, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her jaw clenched so hard the tendons in her neck stood out like cables. She had lost 12 pounds since the courtroom. Her designer dress hung loose at the shoulders. Marcus leaned against the far wall near the boarded-up window, his tie pulled loose, his shirt untucked on one side, his bloodshot eyes flicking between the two exits he had already identified. His snorts had not shaved in days. Vance perched on the very edge of the sofa, his knee bouncing so fast the leather cushion vibrated, his worn medical bag clutched in his lap like a child, holding a stuffed animal during a thunderstorm. His fingernails were bitten down to the quick, the cuticles raw and bleeding. None of them had expected the others to be here. Rebecca glared at Vance with open contempt. Vance stared at the floor, refusing to meet her eyes. Marcus watched all three of us with the cornered desperation of a man calculating the distance to the nearest exit. The anonymous letters had done their work. 3 people who had once trusted each other enough to murder a man together were now sitting in the same room, each one convinced the other 2 were about to betray them. I stepped fully into the room, feeling the broken glass crunch under my boots. I reached behind me and threw the heavy brass deadbolt, driving it home with a single aggressive thrust. The metallic clank echoed through the ruined house like a cell door, slamming shut on a life sentence. Outside in the pouring rain, Detective Morales and his 6-man tactical unit were already in position behind the hedges, their body cameras recording their radios tuned to the wireless microphone I had taped beneath the coffee table 2 hours earlier. I did not sit down. I did not offer pleasantries. I aggressively slammed Dr. Vance's original medical logs onto the glass coffee table. The impact cracked the surface, sending a spiderweb of fractures across the tempered glass. The room went silent. The only sound was the rain hammering the windows. I turned to Vance, pinning him with the full weight of my gaze. "Dr. Vance, do you want to turn yourself in, or let Rebecca turn you into the scapegoat?" My voice cut through the room like a serrated blade drawn across bone. The psychological pressure I had been building for days, the anonymous letters, the FBI-stamped photos, the frozen accounts, all of it detonated simultaneously inside Vance's skull, his entire body violently convulsed. He threw his hands up, his medical bag tumbling to the floor, spilling pill bottles across the carpet. He pointed a trembling accusatory finger directly at Rebecca's face, his eyes wild with animal terror. "It was her who forced me. She told me he had to die before Friday." He screamed, his voice cracking in sheer pathetic desperation. The confession hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. The confession hung in the stale air. Vance was sobbing now, his face buried in his hands, mucus and tears leaking between his fingers. He had spent 2 years torturing a dying man because he was more afraid of losing his medical license than of losing his soul, and now the full weight of that transaction was collapsing on top of him. Rebecca's face contorted, the carefully maintained mask of the grieving widow, the elegant socialite, the devoted stepmother, the persona she had constructed over decades of practice on dying men and their families. all of it vaporized in a single violent instant, revealing the feral, vicious predator that had been hiding underneath the Botox and the silk since the day she first walked into my father's house. "Shut up, you idiot," she roared, her voice cracking into a register I had never heard from her, raw and guttural, and stripped of every ounce of manufactured refinement. Spit flew from her lips. She spun toward Marcus, her eyes bulging with manic desperation, her fingers clawing at the air. "Take care of this brat," she commanded, jabbing her finger in my direction, fully expecting her loyal enforcer to step forward and physically remove me from the room. But Marcus was already backing toward the locked front door, his shoulder blades pressing against the plywood. His face was slick with cold sweat. His ties hung loose around his neck like a noose he had tied himself. His fatal flaw, the absolute bone-deep cowardice that had been hiding behind his financial empire, seized total control of his body. His legs trembled. His voice cracked into a high-pitched stammer. "My accounts are frozen. You are on your own." He raised both hands in full surrender, palms out, fingers splayed. He was done. The money was gone, and without the money, Marcus Thorne was nothing but a terrified middle-aged man, in a wrinkled suit, begging to be let out of a room he had helped lock. I stepped directly into Rebecca's personal space, close enough to smell the expensive perfume she wore, to mask the cheap aerosol that had haunted my childhood. Close enough to see the broken blood vessels in the whites of her eyes, close enough to feel the heat of her panicked breath against my chin. I unleashed 15 years of suppressed agonizing truth. "You were jealous of me from the first day you stepped into this house, because you knew you would always be nothing but a parasite. Put those handcuffs on, it's the only jewelry you deserve." The words landed like artillery shells. Rebecca's face collapsed. Every muscle in her carefully constructed facade gave way at once. The exact moment the last syllable left my mouth, Morales kicked the side door open. The frame exploded inward. Armed officers swarmed the living room from 3 entry points, their tactical flashlights cutting through the dim, rain-soaked darkness. Rebecca shrieked a sound so high-pitched and raw that it cracked the already fractured coffee table glass. She thrashed wildly as an officer wrenched her arms behind her back and the cold steel handcuffs bit into her wrists. Vance dropped to his knees voluntarily, sobbing, his hands already behind his head. Marcus stood motionless against the wall, his empty hands still raised, his face a blank mask of defeat. Outside, the sound of screeching tires ripped through the storm. Emily, who had been waiting in her sports car in the driveway, slammed her foot on the gas pedal in a blind panic at the sight of the police lights. Her car fishtailed on the wet pavement and crashed violently into a parked patrol cruiser. Airbags deployed. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood. An officer yanked her door open and dragged her out onto the wet asphalt. The villains were annihilated. Every single one of them. Months passed. The trial consumed 7 weeks of testimony, 400 exhibits, and the complete psychological disintegration of every defendant. Rebecca took the stand in her own defense, and lasted exactly 14 minutes under cross-examination before Edward Martinez cornered her with the Ohio fraud records and the identity change documentation. She screamed at the judge, called the jury peasants, and had to be physically restrained by 2 bailiffs. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Rebecca received 32 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for racketeering, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and elder abuse. She Snorts was led from the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, her surgically perfected face stripped of makeup for the first time since I had known her. She looked old. She looked ordinary. She looked exactly like what she had always been. A desperate woman from a broke Ohio town, who had tried to steal a life she could never earn. Emily received 12 years as an accessory, and for obstruction of justice. Her Instagram account was suspended within hours of the verdict. Her 1.2 million followers evaporated overnight, migrating to the next manufactured personality without a backward glance. Marcus lost every cent of his offshore fortune, $47 million across 6 jurisdictions, to federal seizure. He was sentenced to 20 years for money laundering and racketeering. His Italian suits were replaced with standard-issue prison khakis. Dr. Alan Vance was permanently stripped of his medical license by the state board and sentenced to 15 years. He wept openly as the bailiff led him from the courtroom in handcuffs, his shoulders shaking with the same pathetic cowardice that had allowed him to torture a dying man for a paycheck. The 3 additional Black Widow cases Morales had identified were reopened based on the evidence from our trial. 2 families received wrongful death settlements. One surviving victim's daughter called me from a payphone in Michigan, sobbing, thanking me for giving her father's death a name. The syndicate that had fed on lonely dying men was permanently dismantled. The scales of justice had been violently, irreversibly balanced. I stood in the center of a bustling construction site on the outskirts of the city, the warm afternoon sun pressing down on my shoulders. I was not wearing my navy dress uniform today. I had requested a leave of absence from active duty, the first voluntary leave in 15 years of continuous service. Just a simple white cotton shirt, civilian jeans and work boots, caked with the same red clay that had stained my father's boots when he surveyed building sites as a young architect. Behind me, steel beams rose against the clear sky, the skeletal frame of a building that would become the John Mendoza Architecture Center. My father's massive fortune, the real fortune that he had secretly transferred into the charity trust, while Rebecca was busy draining the decoy accounts, was being used to fulfill his dying wish. The center would house a free architecture school for low-income students, a permanent gallery featuring 40 years of his designs, and a full-ride scholarship fund in my mother's name. I had personally reviewed every blueprint. I had personally approved every contractor. I had personally driven a ceremonial stake into the ground on the day the foundation was poured, hammering it in with the same rubber mallet my father had used on his first major project in 1985, a mallet I had found in a dusty toolbox in the cellar, wrapped in a cloth that still smelled faintly of sawdust and his aftershave. I watched the cranes lift heavy limestone blocks into place, the cables straining under the weight, and I felt the crushing pressure in my chest finally begin to shift, not disappear, shift. Some weights you carry for life, but they grow lighter when you transform them into something that outlasts the pain, something that stands in the open air and says, "A good man built this, and his daughter made sure the world would remember." I looked down at the tiny hand gripping my fingers. Ethan, a 7-year-old cancer survivor with a buzz cut growing back in soft brown patches, looked up at me with bright, fiercely hopeful eyes that held a depth no child should possess. I had finalized his adoption 3 weeks ago, sitting in a family court that smelled nothing like the criminal courthouse where I had dismantled a syndicate. His biological parents had surrendered him at birth, leaving nothing behind but a hospital bracelet and a name scrawled in ballpoint pen on an intake form. He had spent 5 years in the foster system, bounced between 3 homes before a tumor the size of a golf ball was discovered behind his left eye. He endured 9 months of chemotherapy in a pediatric ward where the nurses became the closest thing he had to family. Admiral Hayes had connected me with the adoption agency. Edward Martinez had handled the legal work pro bono. The social worker told me that Ethan had asked only one question during the finalization hearing. Is she staying? He had fought his war alone in hospital beds and foster homes with the same silent, unbreakable determination I recognized because I had carried it in my own bones for 35 years. Neither of us was alone anymore. I reached up with my free hand and touched my shirt collar. Pinned tightly over my heart was my mother's vintage pearl hairpin. I had gathered every broken piece from the marble floor of the mansion, every cracked pearl, every bent silver wire, and I had taken them to a jeweler in Norfolk who spent 2 weeks painstakingly restoring the pin to its original shape. Emily had tried to destroy my past. I had gathered the shattered fragments and forged them into armor. Holding Ethan's hand, I walked away from the construction site and stepped onto the soft, warm sand of the beach. The ocean stretched out before us, flat and silver under the late afternoon light. I closed my eyes and pulled a deep, shuddering breath of salt air into my lungs, filling every corner, every cavity, every space that had been occupied by grief and rage for 15 years. The Navy had been my escape. The ocean had been the only place wide enough to contain my pain. I had spent a decade and a half running toward the horizon, putting as many nautical miles as possible between myself and the people who were supposed to love me. But as I opened my eyes and watched the tide gently wash over our footprints in the sand, erasing them as easily as the years had erased my father's suffering, I realized the war was finally over. I did not need to run to the ocean for safety anymore. I had burned the corruption out of my family's name. I had honored my father's legacy. I had restored my mother's memory, and I had found in the small, warm grip of a little boy's hand the anchor I had been searching for my entire life. The harbor was no longer a place I had to flee from. It was a place I had built with my own hands, and I was finally ready to stay. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting them back into your life. It means freeing yourself from their chains. So, if this journey resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Drop a comment sharing how you found your own peace after betrayal, because your words might be the exact light someone else needs today.